You wake up. It's 50 BC. The air smells like smoke, bread, and something you'd rather not identify. You're standing in the middle of Rome, the greatest city on Earth, and in your hand, you're holding a small leather pouch. Inside it, 1,000 silver denarii. Now here's the question. Are you rich? You don't know yet, and that uncertainty, that's actually the most honest thing about money in any century. Most people assume that if you handed them a bag of coins in ancient Rome, they'd be set. Like, okay, I've got money, I've got the city, I'll figure the rest out. But here's what nobody tells you. Having money and building wealth are two completely different games. They were in ancient Rome, and they still are right now. So today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to walk through what it would actually take to get rich, not famous, not powerful, just financially secure as a normal, working person in ancient Rome. No emperor status, no inheritance, no political connections. Just you, your 1,000 denarii, and the same psychological traps that trip people up today. Because honestly, the parallels are uncomfortable. Let's start with what money actually meant back then, because context is everything. A Roman legionary soldier, someone with a stable government job, benefits, and a pension, earned about 225 denarii per year during the late Republic. By the time of Augustus, that crept up to around 300. A common laborer, the kind doing construction or farm work, might pull in 1 denarius per day when work was available. But when work was available is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Now, if we try to convert this into something modern, and economists argue about this constantly, so take it as a feel, not a formula. A single denarius had roughly the purchasing power of somewhere between 15 and 25 euros today, depending on what you were buying. So a soldier's annual salary of 225 denarii, that's maybe 4,000 to 5,000 euros in real purchasing power. Not a lot. A laborer working every single day? Similar range. The point isn't the exact number. The point is this. Rome was a city where most people were one bad season away from serious trouble. Sound familiar? So you, standing there with your 1,000 denarii, about 4 years of a soldier's wages, you're not rich, but you're not desperate either. You're in that exact same anxious middle ground that a lot of people today know too well. Enough to feel like you should be doing something smart with it, not enough to feel safe doing nothing. Here's where it gets real. Rome, at its peak, had over 1 million people crammed into a city that wasn't designed for 1 million people. The vast majority of them lived in buildings called insulae, essentially ancient apartment blocks, tall, narrow, badly built, occasionally on fire. Sound dramatic? Landlords in ancient Rome were notorious for cutting corners. There were actual laws passed trying to limit building height because these things kept collapsing. Rent for a single room in an insula in a decent neighborhood, roughly 200 to 400 denarii per year, and that's before you eat anything. Food was your second major expense. The Roman state did subsidize grain, the famous annona, but you still needed to buy olive oil, vegetables, maybe a bit of meat if you were doing well. A basic but sustainable diet probably cost somewhere around 1 denarius per day, maybe less if you were disciplined about it. So let's do the honest math. You're spending maybe 300 denarii on rent, another 300 on food for the year. That's 600 gone before you've bought a single sandal or paid for anything unexpected. Out of your 1,000, you've got 400 left, and that's assuming nothing goes wrong. That's the trap. That's the same trap millions of people are in right now, spending 60, 70, 80% of their income just to exist, and then wondering why they can't seem to move forward. The cost of being alive in an expensive city has always been the enemy of building wealth. This isn't new. This isn't a modern invention. It's ancient. So how did people actually build wealth in Rome? There were really 3 main paths, and each one maps onto something you'd recognize today. The first was land. In Rome, owning agricultural land, farmland outside the city, was considered the most respectable and stable form of wealth. Wealthy Romans were obsessed with it, almost philosophically. The idea was simple. Land produces food, food has eternal value, and unlike a business or a loan, land doesn't disappear. This is your ancient equivalent of owning physical real estate that generates income. It compounds slowly, it's illiquid, it's boring, and it worked. The problem? Good land was expensive and increasingly controlled by the elite. For a regular person with 1,000 denarii, buying meaningful farmland was largely out of reach unless you pooled resources, moved to a less desirable area, or got lucky. Sound like trying to buy property in Lisbon or Athens right now? The second path was money lending, thanos, essentially private lending with interest. Rome had no central bank. If someone needed capital to start a business or fund a voyage, they borrowed privately, often at rates between 8 and 12% annually, sometimes higher for riskier ventures. For a person with savings, becoming a lender was one of the few ways to make your money work without physically doing more work. This is the ancient version of earning yield on capital. The risk was real. Borrowers defaulted, disputes ended up in court, wars disrupted trade, but for sophisticated lenders who spread their risk carefully, this was how real money was made. Cicero himself was involved in lending. It was completely normalized among the educated class. The third path is the one modern audiences find uncomfortable, and it should be said clearly, slavery was an economic institution in Rome, not a footnote. Wealthy Romans invested in enslaved people as labor assets, skilled craftspeople, educated administrators, doctors, teachers. Some enslaved people were permitted to run businesses and keep a portion of profits, accumulating enough to eventually purchase their own freedom. The entire economy was structured around this in ways that made it nearly inescapable. It's historically accurate, it's deeply disturbing, and it's important to understand it. Not to glorify it, because ignoring it would mean pretending Rome's wealth wasn't built on a foundation of human suffering. It was. And that context matters. The real lesson here, the one that translates, is this. Every wealthy Roman was doing some version of the same thing. They were converting their money into income-producing assets rather than letting it sit. Land that generates crops, loans that generate interest, workshops that generate revenue. The principle isn't complicated, it's ancient, and it's still the core of how wealth actually builds. Now, you've been careful, you saved, you lent wisely, maybe you bought a small plot of land, you feel like you're finally getting somewhere. Then, Emperor Nero comes along. In the 60s AD, facing financial pressure from a massive fire that destroyed much of Rome and his own, let's call it enthusiastic spending habits, Nero did what desperate governments have always done. He debased the currency. He reduced the silver content of the denarius, quietly, gradually, while keeping the face value the same. Over time, more coins were issued with less actual silver in them. Prices adjusted, the purchasing power of every denarii you were holding began to quietly shrink every year. This is inflation. Not metaphorical inflation, literal, historical, ancient inflation caused by a government printing, or in this case, minting its way out of trouble. If you had been sitting on a pile of coins, doing nothing, trusting that your savings held their value, you were slowly getting poorer without spending a single coin. Your 400 denarii of savings silently became worth less every year. But if you owned land, the land still grew crops. If you had productive assets, they still generated real output. The people who survived currency debasement in Rome were the people who had converted their money into things that retained intrinsic value. The psychology here is fascinating and painful. Saving feels responsible. It feels like discipline. And in a stable system, it is. But the Roman experience, and frankly most of economic history since, shows that holding purely in cash or currency is a passive risk that most people never think about until it's too late. So, could a normal person actually get rich in ancient Rome? Here's my honest answer. Not easily, but not impossibly either. The people who built wealth weren't the ones with the most coins. They were the ones who understood what money was for. Not to hold, but to deploy. They took their savings, accepted calculated risk, diversified across assets that produced real output, and stayed patient long enough for compounding to do its quiet work.
They also faced the same psychological barriers you and I do: the fear of losing what you have, the social pressure to spend, the exhaustion of just keeping up with basic costs, the confusion about which risk is worth taking. Rome didn't solve these problems. Neither did any century after it. But here's what actually changed for the people who got ahead. They stopped asking, "How do I protect my money?" and started asking, "How do I make my money produce something?" That shift from preservation to production is still the sharpest edge in personal finance 2,000 years later. Your 1,000 denarii are waiting. What are you going to do with them?